Wendell, you have a big idea. This isn't just an observation here. You have a big idea of what to do with this, which is the convening of an international Congress, a first international Congress for the governance of AI. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about your concept for that. So a Congress implies representation. So there'll be representatives, not only from around the world, but as you were saying before, multi-stakeholder or multi-sector. So I'm imagining it's not just, national representation and so on, but we have representation from the tech companies, from civil society, that, this sort of notion of some kind of inclusive conversation about where we're going with emerging tech. So maybe you could just say a little bit more about the Congress itself and how you're thinking about that process.
Sure. Well, let me first give a little bit of background. At the time when we started organizing an international Congress for the governance of artificial intelligence, there was actually very little happening internationally. There were certainly meetings on cybersecurity. There were meetings on digital standards. There was a little bit of discussion around privacy. There was certainly meetings around whether lethal autonomous weapons should be restrained. That was the context in which we walked in, and we began organizing a Congress that we saw as a multi-stakeholder forum. So business would be represented, governments would be represented, civil society would be represented in many different forms, including educators and NGOs. And we also were particularly concerned about having significant representation from underserved communities, including indigenous, small nations and indigenous populations. Now, since we began the organization of that, there's been a dramatic shift. And the shift is that a lot of multinational or multilateral, organizations are jumping into this space. The UN, the OECD, the G7 with leadership from Canada and France. The World Economic Forum has been weighing in on that, the G20. And so that's shifted a little bit what the Congress may or may not be. Because in effect, the governmental leaders, and to some extent, the corporations with a little bit of representation from the NGOs have started organizing independently. And therefore, that has made the Congress that we were planning, that was to have been in Prague in April, has been postponed to Prague in October, and I suspect we will postpone it again till next May, because I doubt many people will be traveling in October, but we're still monitoring that. That's made our stress much more on the multi-stakeholder dimension of bringing people together. And we do believe that if the stakeholder groups are significant enough, then that will get enough of the national and industry leaders to also show up. So in that regard, we've been looking at various proposals and initiatives that would help nurture multi-stakeholder development. Now, we are not in a position to have a Congress where we can determine who the delegates will be or whether they are proportional. So this is not going to be a Congress in any true legislative sense. And it may actually be very limited in terms of what comes out of it or what kinds of initial clout it has. But my own concern is a bit broader than that. I think we need to begin laying the foundations for the 21st century institutions now. And in many cases, they are going to need to replace some of the international multilateral institutions we have that are not very effective. And particularly in technology, they need to be much more multi-stakeholder, because we can't be, what shall I say, reinventing the human species, perhaps even out of its own existence, without an actual participation from the world citizenry. So the multi-stakeholder dimension becomes really important. And in that regard, we've been working particularly hard to ensure that element. We've been working particularly hard to ensure that China will be present. And they did commit to me that they would be present. We have even invited Madam Fu Ling to be one of the vice chairs of the Congress, which was to be chaired by Michael Mueller, who had stepped down as Director General of the UN in Geneva. And another initiative we have been engaged in has been trying to help nurture a network of stakeholders from small nations, underserved communities, indigenous populations. Now, I don't belong to any of those communities, but that hasn't altered the fact that actually by making it clear that we wanted their representation, and we'd even have a training session for those who were not digitally literate in advance of the Congress, that have been able to stimulate developing that a bit. And indeed, we even had a foundation which wants to remain nameless, that has given us a matching grant for scholarships to bring significant representation from that community to the Congress. Now, whether the Congress happens or not, those are seeds that need to be germinated. And that's a lot of what we're focusing on at the moment.